right, so Troy was just talking about Halloween being in a few weeks, but after Halloween, we get into the other holidays, we get into Thanksgiving. So I want you just to think ahead to Thanksgiving, about a little over a month from now. At Thanksgiving dinner, what are the two subjects that you're not supposed to bring up if you want to have a harmonious Thanksgiving dinner? Politics and religion. These are the two subjects that you're not supposed to bring up if you want to have a good, harmonious, calm, easygoing Thanksgiving dinner, or frankly, any nice, calm, extended family dinner. Not supposed to bring up politics, you're not supposed to bring up religion. Now, it's even more contentious if you bring them up in tandem. If you bring up the connection between religion and politics. That said, I'd like to introduce you to what we're going to talk about this morning. Peter, in the book of 1 Peter, the reason we're calling this series Wherever You Are is because one of the really powerful things that Peter does, especially in chapters 2 and 3 of this letter, is that he talks to Christians and he says, all right, we are placed in different settings, or sometimes we'll use the term life stations. Some of you are married, some of you are single. Some of you are in jobs that you really, really like and that are career-oriented jobs. Some of you are in jobs that are just kind of jobs. This is a job that I do to get things done. Some of you are staying at home and taking care of children. Others of you are in jobs where you're away for long amounts of time. Peter speaks to different groups and says, all right, here's the deal. Wherever you are, wherever your life station right now, your goal is not to try to get yourself out of that. Your goal and your purpose is to shine the light of Jesus wherever you are. To shine the light of Jesus within your marriage, whether it's going really, really great or whether it's painful and frustrating. Your calling is to shine the light of Jesus in your place of work, if you love it and if it's a really uplifting environment or if it's a really difficult environment. And you're called to shine the light of Jesus in the country in which he's placed you, if you're really, really excited about the government and really, really excited about the nation, or if you're not. And the calling that we're going to talk about today is our calling as citizens. Now, if you know the Bible, you know that we're told in the book of Philippians, as Christians, our ultimate citizenship is in heaven. But we are still each placed as a country. And there may be a few of you in here that you're not, you're foreign exchange students or you're visiting. But for most of us in here, we're American citizens. This is a place where God has placed us. And so because of that, we're going to talk about the whole deal. All right, how does our faith fit into this? How does our faith fit into how we live as citizens? In 1960s, some of you will remember this, John F. Kennedy was running for president. And when he was running for president, there was a lot of discussion about how his Catholicism should or could impact how he would conduct himself as a president. And when he was discussing this, one of the statements that he made is he said, I don't want to talk a lot about the kind of church I believe in, which should matter only to me. And the point that he was making was sort of, my personal religious beliefs are exactly that, just my personal religious beliefs, and they shouldn't worry anyone else. What we're going to get as we read through 1 Peter is a view that's different than that, a view that, as I'll put up on the screen right here, that for those of us as Christians, our public life and our private life are connected, that they're not utterly separated. We don't believe in just a privatized faith that nobody needs to know about and nobody has a right to know about. We believe in a faith that impacts our public life. And at the same time, for probably the past 30 years or so in our country, there's been a much more strong and overt movement that the calling for Christians is not to keep our faith private, but the calling for Christians is to do things where we are sort of looking to take over and take control of our culture and of our government. And as we look through what Peter says, that's actually not where he focuses his attention either. He doesn't focus his attention on the idea that we're supposed to take over. He also doesn't focus his attention on the idea that we're just supposed to stay out. Our calling is to live as citizens, for those of us that are American citizens here in the United States of America, to live out that calling in a way that the people who are the power brokers in our country are glad that we're here, that we are shining the light of Jesus wherever we are. Now, here, just to kind of outline for you what we're going to talk about, we're going to be in 1 Peter chapter 2, verses 13 through 17. So if you have a Bible, you can open up and start to turn there if you use the little bulletin app on our LBF Church app, or if you use some kind of YouVersion on your phone, you can turn there to 1 Peter chapter 2, verse 13. And as we're going to go through this, I'll just tell you right now, here's how Peter walks through this passage on the whole idea of how we respond to society, how we engage with society as Christians. He's going to talk to us about our posture towards society, our attitude, our posture towards society. He's going to talk to us about our purpose in society. And then he's going to talk to us about our priorities in society, our posture, our purpose, and our priorities. Now, again, if you have a Bible, you can look there. We're going to start with our posture in verses 13 and 14. Peter says, all right, let me just set the table here. He's just got done talking about what I believe is the main passage in the whole book, saying, all right, your calling is to abstain from sinful lusts, which wage war against the soul, and your calling is to live such good lives that you shine the light of Jesus wherever you are, and people that want to be critical of Jesus find themselves giving him a second look. And so he continues on this in verse 13. He says, submit yourselves for the Lord's sake to every human authority, whether the emperor as the supreme authority or to governors who are sent by him to punish those who do wrong and to commend those who do right. All right, so let me just walk through this. We'll just kind of get the facts of what Peter's saying here, and then we'll talk through some of the implications. So just bare bones. He says, all right, submit yourselves to every human institution, to every governing authority. There are some people that kind of debate, when he's talking about authority here, is it okay for us to just apply this more broadly to authority, like parents with children, or teachers, or employers? And I would say it's not really what he has in view here. There are some other passages where that's taken on more directly. Really, he's talking about this with society. The examples he gives are the governor, the emperor, and governors. So he's talking about our response as citizens within a country. He says, submit yourselves. And submission is not exactly the same as obedience, but there's a large overlap with this. Submission is a more military term. And all right, how many of you have been in the military before? All right, if you're in the military, when you're told to do something, what do? Yeah, sir, yes, sir. You do it. You're ordering yourself under, which is what the word submission means, sort of ordering yourself under. So you have that orderliness. That's the idea of submission. So Peter is saying, all right, you order yourself under the governing authorities, whether it's the emperor or whether it's the the governors that the emperor sets out. You don't just say, well, I respect the ultimate authority, but I don't respect these underlings. Yeah, you respect them all. You respect them all, you submit to them all. And he gives a little note at the end where he just talks about the whole idea. Here's what, at a broad scale, these governing authorities are looking to do. They're looking to punish people who do wrong, and they're looking to commend people that do right. The government exists to look to do positive things to people who are doing good things, and looks to punish or hold accountable people that are doing bad things. So that's the bare bones. What's our posture towards society? Our posture towards society is that we submit to governing authorities. We're not out for a rebellion. We're not out for a revolution. We are submitting ourselves to the governing authorities. Now, before going even further, some of you're already thinking about it. You're already thinking, but wait a second, aren't there exceptions to this? The reason I know you're already thinking about it is because we live in the United States of America with hyper-individualism, and we all think we're the exception to the rule. So some of us are thinking, but wait a second, he's saying submit, but there are exceptions to this right. And it's true, there are exceptions to this. Think of who's writing this. The Apostle Peter is writing this right now. Now, if you've been reading through Acts in our Bible reading plan, or if you're just familiar with the book of Acts, we're in Acts chapter 15 in the Bible reading plan, and Peter has already gone to prison twice. One time, Peter was faced with the Jewish authorities that said, all right, we're going to let you go, just don't talk about Jesus anymore. And Peter said, I want you to make up your mind whether we should listen to you or listen to God. And they just sort of walked away. There are clearly exceptions. There are times where we do come to a moment where we either obey God or we obey the governing authorities. If you read through the book of Daniel and his friends come up against this a few times, where Daniel decides he'd rather be thrown into a lion's den than disobey God. Where Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego say, you know what, we'll be thrown into the fiery furnace before we bow down to that idol. There are exceptions to the rule. There are times when the government is calling us to do something that is absolutely a violation of what God's calling us to do. And when that happens, we obey God. So there's the exception. But here's what I want to point out. Peter apparently thinks that that is such a rare case that he doesn't even bring it up here. He doesn't even say, but there are exceptions. Paul in Romans 13, if you want to ever look up a parallel passage to this, where he says much the same of what Peter says here, submit to the governing authorities. Peter, who is constantly in prison, Paul, who is constantly in prison, both of them, when they bring up the government, they don't say, well, you got to obey them if they're in the right. He says, we submit to governing authorities, even though these are men that were unjustly put in prison in different ways. We need to take a cue from this, and the cue is this. The cue that we take from this is that we should assume it is going to be the very, very rare occasion when we're choosing, do I obey the government or do I obey God? That situation is not going to come around very much. It comes around so rarely that even the apostles aren't even bringing it up, because they're going to assume that most of us are not going to face that. Now, submission doesn't mean you've got to love the governing authorities. In fact, submission sort of implies that you're having to make an active effort to submit to the governing authorities and that you don't always love what's going on. Which, by the way, I just have to bring this up. These verses, the verses about submit to governing authorities here in Romans 13, I find that these verses come out from Christians usually only when their desired politician is in office. Barack Obama gets into office and all of a sudden liberal Christians are like, oh yeah, I remember those verses. Let's get those out real quick. And then President Trump gets into office and a whole bunch of conservative or Republican people are like, oh good, we can finally break out those verses after 8 years of silence on them. These verses apply. This applies no matter who is in office. And we happen to, I believe we're very blessed to live in a country where dissent is not open rebellion. We live in a country, if you're involved in peaceful protest, that doesn't mean that you're not submitting to the governing authorities. If you're voicing dissent or voicing disagreement, that doesn't mean you're not submitting to the governing authorities. We live in a country where we actually get to practice a lot of dissent and practice peaceful protest, and we're still submitting to the laws. We're still obeying the rules. So again, this doesn't mean you got to always talk glowingly about the people in charge. You don't. That's not what it means to submit. But to submit does mean that we assume the norm is that I can obey the laws of the land and that's not going to violate my Christian faith or whatever God is calling me to do. Now, just as the overall attitude, I do want to put something in there for this because there can be a tendency for us as Christians to think that really the real power that's going on in the world relates to the government and relates to who's in charge politically. And so we can end up putting a lot of stock in that. And what I want to say is that as Christians and as citizens, we're called to be involved in the political process and to practice our responsibilities as citizens. All of that is part of our calling. But we do it with the perspective that what we now see, the people who are in charge right now, the people who are in power right now, are not necessarily that important. They're simply the people in power right now. In fact, look again at what Peter says. He doesn't say, submit to all the governing authorities because they're really good or because they're really powerful or because they're really moral. He tells the reason why we will submit. He says, submit yourselves for the Lord's sake. Submit yourselves for the Lord's sake. He says, do this, not because of them, do this because of Jesus. Have you ever had something that somebody asked you to do and you really didn't want to do it and maybe didn't think it was a good idea, but somebody that you love said, will you do it for me? Right now, every husband is like, yes. And you're like, all right, I don't really want to do it. I don't even know if it's a good idea, but I'll do it because I love you. Peter is saying, all right, don't do it because of them. Don't do it because you think that they're smart or that they're noble or that they're great at this. Do it for Jesus. Do it because this is Jesus calling for you. And Paul goes further. Again, if you want to read Romans 13 later on when the Apostle Paul talks about this, he says something that I think Peter would also affirm, but Peter doesn't overtly affirm. And that's that Paul says, there's no authority set up right now that hasn't been put there by God. Now, just especially if you don't know the Bible very well, even if you do know the Bible well and you knew that was in there, does that trouble any of you? That troubles most of us. We're like, wait a second, God did that? God put him there? God put her there? But how is that possible? Now, here's the deal. What we need to understand with that is that is not Paul saying everybody in charge is godly. What he's saying is sometimes God puts godly people in charge. Sometimes God puts in charge people that are indifferent. And sometimes God puts in charge people who are hostile, but he can use any of those people for his purposes. God put King David in charge of Israel for a while, a man after God's own heart, a godly king who led well. God was the one who did that. God also put Cyrus in charge of Persia when the Israelites were in exile, and Cyrus was not a godly man. But God moved in Cyrus's heart to the point that Cyrus decided to let the Jews go back and rebuild Jerusalem. God doesn't need a godly king to get the job done. Not only that, but God sometimes appoints somebody hostile. If you go all the way back to the book of Exodus, when the Israelites were in exile in Egypt, Pharaoh was an oppressive, hostile, godless king. And what God says about Pharaoh is not, how did this guy get in charge? What God says about Pharaoh in Exodus 9:16 is, but I have raised you up for this very purpose, that I might show you my power and that my name might be proclaimed in all the earth. He says, Pharaoh, here's why I put you here, so that you would oppose me and you would lose. And you would lose publicly, and you would lose historically, and 2,000, 3,000 years later, people would still be talking about what I did. God doesn't need a godly leader. He uses godly leaders, indifferent leaders, godless leaders. Paul's just given us the comfort of saying, God is never saying, how did this election happen? God is orchestrating things. We can have hope in that. And again, just real quick before moving on, sometimes we can get into our heads just this is the end all. Being in power here is the end all. I don't believe that that's how God is viewing things. Our kids, for Karina and I, our kids have been involved in sports for several years now. And one of the funny things that happens when you do the kids sports thing is you interact with people who are officials of the sports. They're the officials of Little League, or they're the officials of ASO. And most of the people that I've interacted with who are the officials of these kids' sports, they're doing it because they want to help and they're doing it to serve. But every once in a while, you run into somebody that has a position within the sports league that's sort of on a power trip. And every time I run into one of those people, there's a Little League official that sort of is, thinking that they're a powerful person. My thought is always the same. My thought is always, you can have it. You can have it. You can be the one in charge here. You can be the big head honcho here. That's fine. You can have that. Because in the end, I don't see it as a terribly important position. It just makes me wonder how God thinks about our presidential elections. I just wonder if there's a similar attitude towards God saying, all right, you want to be president? All right, that's fine. Not really going to affect how I'm running the world. You can go ahead and does God shrug off presidential elections like we shrug off PTA board elections? God is not limited by the people in power right now. And if you read the book of Daniel, I think the reason why Daniel, when he was in Babylon, was so able to continue to trust God in the midst of all these governments that were coming through is because he knew none of these kings is the final king. None of these kingdoms is the final kingdom. He had peace and he continued to follow God's calling for him because he knew the people in charge right now are not the people in charge in the end. God is going to sort this out. So our posture towards society, for Jesus' sake, and because of the hope that Jesus gives us, is that we're freed up to submit instead of raging against what we experience. Our posture is submission. But now he's going to talk to say there's something further. There's a big purpose here. There's a reason why God doesn't just pull us out of society or tell us to cloister ourselves. There's a greater purpose. And he gets into that starting in verse 15. He says, "For it is God's will that by doing good, you should silence the ignorant talk of foolish people." He says, here's the reason why you're in society. And if you were here last week, it's very similar to what he said in verse 12, just a few verses before this. He says, here's the reason why you're in society. You're in society to live lives that are so good that the ignorant talk of foolish people who want to slander Jesus, slander God, slander the church, slander Christianity, that want to come up with bad things to say about all of that they're going to find themselves coming up blank. Because when they think of Christians, all they can come up with is the good deeds that the Christians are doing in society. Our calling is to live in such a way that our mayors, our governors, our senators, our president are saying, gosh, I'm so glad that they're there. And what would we do? How would we get hungry people fed if Christians weren't there helping out? How would we have people feeling safe? How would we have people getting counsel after a horrific evil event like Las Vegas if we didn't have Christians stepping in and helping out in different ways? How would we get meals to people who have cancer if it wasn't Christians stepping in and helping out in different ways? How is it that we would get care bags to the homeless if Christians weren't stepping in and helping out in different ways? It says, engaged in society in such a way that even though there are going to be some people that want to find a way to slander Christianity, that they're going to say, I'm having a hard time. And the idea is not just that then we get to feel good about ourselves because people aren't slandering us, but that people say, maybe I should give Jesus a second look. Maybe I should rethink my stance towards Jesus, because if this is what he produces, if this is what he does in people that have the hope that they're not freaked out over what's going on in politics, that they're able to talk with politeness to people who disagree with them, that they're reaching out and care to people who are different than them, maybe there's something to this. And Peter goes on, he says, all right, live as free people. And I'm not 100% sure, but here's where I'm pretty sure this is coming from. I'm pretty sure there are certain Christians that are saying, all right, here's the deal. The emperor's not my king. Jesus is my king. And the citizenship that I have right now, all right, it's temporary. I have citizenship in heaven. So sort of acting like, well, I don't really need to worry about this right now because I have a different citizenship and I have a different final emperor. I have a different final king. And Peter says, all right, live in light of that reality. You are free. You have a different final king. Caesar is not your king. Jesus is your king. All that is true. But he says, but don't use your freedom as a cover-up for evil. Don't use that reality as an excuse to be a difficult person in the society that he's placed you. Live as God's slaves. Live as God's servants. Live with the purpose that you are shining the light of Jesus wherever you are. And where you are right now is as citizens of the United States. It's part of Southern California culture. Here's where I've placed you. Shine the light here. Don't use your freedom as an excuse to be a difficult person. Use your freedom in order to serve other people. So he says we have a purpose. We have a posture. Our posture is that we're not freaked out by what's going on politically. We have hope in Jesus. We assume that for the most part, in almost every situation, there's not going to be a conflict between following Jesus and obeying the laws of the land and being respectful to our leaders. And our purpose is to shine the light of Jesus. But then Peter goes towards something else. He talks about a priority. And it's profound what he does in this last section, in this last verse, in verse 17, because he gives rapid fire commands here. To this point, he's just kind of been talking reasonably, and there's this reasonable flow. Then he gets into verse 17 and just 4 quick commands that he's going to name up. He's going to talk about how we conduct ourselves towards everyone, how we conduct ourselves towards other Christians, how we conduct ourselves towards God, and how we conduct ourselves towards the emperor. So he says, show proper respect to everyone, love the family of believers, speaking of other Christians, fear God, honor the emperor. Now, I want to show you guys the priority that he lays out here, but first let me just point something out that you might not catch in English. The word that he uses for the first command is the same as the word that he uses for the last command. It's translated slightly differently here in the English, but really the more literal would just be honor everyone, honor the emperor. And then we get commands about believers and we get commands about God. And so what Peter is doing here is not only giving us 4 rapid fire commands, he's actually given us a helpful hierarchy for how we think about our conduct within society. And I want to visualize it for you on the screen together. But let's just start here. All right, if we're talking about a hierarchy of how we think about how we handle different relationships, who do you think is going to be at the top of this pyramid? God, very good. You came to church, you said God, you're correct. All right, fear God is at the top. Some of you know this. The most frequent command in the Bible, in both the Old Testament and the New Testament, the most frequent command is do not fear. Do not be afraid. Over and over again. Don't be afraid of them. Don't be afraid of the opposing armies. Don't be afraid. Don't be afraid. Don't be afraid. Don't be afraid. There's one person that we are told to fear. God. God is the only one who gets our fear. And it's a little hard to understand fear. Some people want to write off this part, but I do absolutely believe that part of fearing God is saying, I don't want to mess around because I don't want to deal with the consequences. That's a totally legitimate part of fearing God. It's just saying, I'm going to obey God because I don't want to deal with the fallout if I don't obey God. That's part of the deal. But a bigger part of the deal is the idea that we are treating God with the weight to which he is due. If you are fearing, if you're an Israelite and God has promised you military victory, promised you, I'm going to deliver you from all of this, and you're looking at the opposing army and you see them coming and you're afraid of them, here's what God says. God says, you are treating them like they're the ones calling the shots. Don't be afraid of them. They're not in charge. Fear me. When we conduct ourselves in the world as if whether it's the president or the governor or political people or people in the media in Hollywood, if we treat them as if they are the people who really have the power, we are disordered in how we're viewing the world. We do fear God in the sense that we say, I don't want to disobey God because I don't want to deal with the fallout of that. I don't want to deal with the consequences. But we also fear God in the sense that we treat him as if the promises that he makes really are the bottom line. So, all right, so fear God, and maybe this would be a surprising part. Next on sort of this pyramid is how we treat each other as Christians. He says, love fellow believers, love the family of God. And he's not saying love Christians and don't love anyone else, but the vast majority of the times in the New Testament that Christians are called to love, that love is directed towards one another. And it's not because God cares about Christians and he doesn't care about other people, or we're supposed to treat other people who are not Christians as if they don't matter. It's just a sense of priority, saying this is the community to which God has called you, give them your priority. Not only with affection, but with financial care and with thoughtfulness and with prayer, that this is where you're focusing your attention. And we see this even within our own families. There is nothing, every child in the world has equal value before God. But it is not strange that you are more stressed out when your kid is sick than some kid in Ethiopia. It's not strange. It's not you being a heartless person or a racist or anything like that. It's just you saying, well, of course, I care more about this child. This is my child. God has given you that child, and it's appropriate for you to give priority, to say, this is the child that God has given me. I'm not saying they're more valuable than this other child, but I'm supposed to give them priority. Peter is saying, you're given priority to other Christians because that's your family. Those are your brothers and sisters. Those are the people that God has brought you into family with. So yes, you give priority to them with your financial giving and with your care and with praying and with checking in with people and with giving preference. There's a focus there. There's a love there that's really significant. So he says, all right, fear God, love fellow believers. And then what we have is we have 2 commands that are the same command, just towards different groups. It says, honor everyone, honor the emperor. Now, I'll just tell you, because there's a lot of things in the Bible that are just absolutely clear. It's not hard to figure out what it's saying. I'm going to say I think there's a connection here. I'm 90% sure this is what Peter's doing, but I'll just leave the caveat to say if you disagree with me, I might be wrong on this. But I think Peter is making a point by using the same word to say honor everyone and honor the emperor. Peter doesn't say disregard the emperor. He says, all right, honor the emperor. But you know why you honor the emperor? Because the emperor is included in everyone. Honor everyone, honor the emperor. Peter sets this up where the emperor is on the same level as everyone. So yeah, you're not gonna disrespect, you're not gonna name call, you're not gonna slander the emperor. You know why not? Because he's part of everyone. And because our conduct towards everyone is that we would honor them. Not always agree with them, not always even understand where they're coming from, but to honor them. Our calling as believers is to show honor, to show respect, to show politeness, to show care to everyone. Now, let me just speak pointedly about this for a few minutes. I know a lot of the dishonoring that we do towards one another is due to what some people call digital courage. When you get on your phone or you get behind the computer and all of a sudden you're a really bold person. All of a sudden, you're a real truth teller. Our dishonoring one another, especially as Christians, is tragic, especially when we get into the political realm. I said this openly, and I'll say this openly before. I want us to have people of different political opinions at this church. If we were a church of people all with one political opinion, I would start to get worried. Because I know 50% of the country thinks something else. It is absolutely appropriate that we would have people of different political opinions here. Every time I'm on social media, because I've never heard somebody say it in person, every time I'm in social media and I see some Republican person refer to other Christians as libtards, my heart breaks a little bit. That is so dishonorable. That is so dishonoring to other human beings, let alone brothers and sisters in Christ. Every time I'm on social media and I see some very liberal Christian person talk about other people or people that disagree on immigration or think we should have stricter regulation on immigration, and some liberal Christian refer to all the people who disagree with them as racists. That's so dishonoring. That's so dishonorable. Honor everyone. You don't have to agree with everyone. You don't even agree with everything with your spouse. You don't agree with everything with your best friends. Of course you're going to disagree with them. I mean, for heaven's sake, Fernando's wearing a Cubs jersey up here. I don't even know what's happening right now. But I've been distracted the whole time, and I avoided saying something for long. Can we just pause and pray for Fernando? Sorry, dude. It's so distracting. Okay. All right, anyway. But I know I've just thwarted myself with that. But genuinely, why would we have the expectation that you have to agree with someone in order to honor them? Frankly, if you sit down with people who disagree with you politically or disagree with you on social issues, and if you genuinely try to understand where they're coming from, you might not change your mind. You might say, no, I think that they're wrong. But it's likely that even if you don't change your mind, you will at least walk away saying, I get how they got there. And I don't think that they got there because they're stupid or because they're immoral or for any of those reasons. I think that they just got there maybe through what my opinion is some faulty reasoning, but I understand why they got there. And I can honor them for that. And I can talk about them with respect and care instead of dishonoring them. I'm not even kidding about this. Some of you need to repent of the way that you handle things on social media. Some of you need to just stop for a month or two with social media because you don't seem to be capable of controlling yourselves in this area. We need to honor each other. He doesn't even say just honor Christians. He says honor everyone. Honor the emperor. You can disagree with the president. You can think that the president's wrong on things. You can talk about facts about where you think the president is wrong. You don't need to slander the president. That's dishonoring the president. And it's bad to dishonor the president because we're called to honor everyone. Our calling as believers is to be a benefit to society, to be people that the leaders in society are saying, we're so glad that they're here. Because where would all the good things that are happening, where would all of those go if we didn't have the Christians here? And the great news that Peter gives us is that our devotion to society flows out of our devotion to Christ. And our devotion to society can be greater because our ultimate hope is not that one day we're finally going to get it right. Our ultimate hope is that Jesus is coming back. And the reason it's such good news that Jesus is coming back is because the final king, the final emperor, is someone who is willing to lay down his life for us. The final emperor, the final King Jesus, he's not power hungry. He's not insecure. He's not trying to convince everybody and get people on his side. He is the King of Kings, and he's also the one that laid down his life to bring us forgiveness and bring us into the family. You can be disappointed after an election. You can be disappointed in actions by a president. That's totally normal. But as Christians, we don't have to be alarmed. And you know what else we don't have to do? We don't have to fear, because only God himself is truly in charge of the events going on in our world. We trust in the one true King. And one of the things that our one true King Jesus said is he said he wanted us to do something regularly until he came back. And the thing that he wanted us to regularly do until he came back was to celebrate the picture that he'd given us of his broken body and his shed blood that we do through communion. If you're going to be helping out with communion, you can head back to Tom right now as we prepare for this. When we take communion, of course, it's a remembrance of the sacrifice. It's a sober celebration of the sacrifice, of the price that was paid by Jesus to forgive us of our sins and bring us into the family. But Jesus said, I want you to keep doing this until I get back, because it not only is a celebration of what he did, it's the anticipation of the fact that he's coming back and that the King who laid down his life in the end will be the final King of Kings. So as we prepare to take the elements, let's go ahead and pray together. Father, thank you so much for your grace. Thank you so much for giving us hope in Jesus. Thank you that when we see things that alarm us or surprise us or trouble us about politics in our country and in our world, that we don't have to despair and we don't have to be alarmed. You're certainly not alarmed and you're certainly not surprised. Father, I pray that you lead us to live with the kind of hope and the kind of sacrifice that will point people towards you. I pray that people who even sense that they're opposed to you will be drawn towards Jesus because they see the kinds of lives that we live. Father, may we live in a way that the people who are in charge of our areas are glad that we're here because we are shining the light of Jesus and good things are happening. We pray as we partake in these elements that you bring us the reminder of your goodness and of the hope that we have beyond the powers that we see right now, the hope that you will one day bring to fruition through Jesus' return. We pray this in Jesus' name. Amen.